So we are going to continue here talking about the Psalms. We're going to begin with Psalm 51. It's titled, Create in Me a Clean Heart, O God. To the choir master, a psalm of David, when Nathan the prophet went to him after he had gone into Bathsheba. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you only, have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words, and blameless in your judgment. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, you delight in truth in the inward being, and you teach me wisdom in the secret heart. Purge me with hyssop, I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have broken rejoice. Hide your face from my sins, and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with the willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. Deliver me from blood guiltness, O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your righteousness. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Do good to Zion in your good pleasure. Build up the walls of Jerusalem. Then will you delight in the right sacrifices, in burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then bulls will be offered on your altar. So another interesting psalm puts things into perspective. Previous questions of the Old Testament, I think, are beginning to be answered here. So let's break this down. So this is titled, Create in Me a Clean Heart, O God. So this is to the wandering mind, perhaps a admission that whoever the author is, they do not have a clean heart. Whether that be Nathan or David. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me of my sin. So fairly straightforward. It is the basic component of being faithful, this sort of recognition of the fallen nature, the recognition of the gross immoral behavior that one engages in, and the wish to be cleansed of that sin, which means a process of recognizing what that sin is and how to liberate oneself from it. And accordingly, he says, For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you only have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. So an interesting statement there in verse 5. As if David is the author of this psalm. He was conceived by Jesse and Ruth, both of which were known to be God-fearing people. Jesse of a royal lineage of Abraham. But Ruth was a Moabite woman, not necessarily of the tribes of Israel. And so perhaps this is what he was talking about when he was conceived in sin. He could also be referring to just the general nature of man, being fallen creatures. Behold, you delight in truth, in the inward being, and you teach me wisdom in the secret heart. So what might that mean? You delight in truth in the inward being. So from what I understand, this inward being is the true self, the undeceived self. And in this environment, in this honest environment, God delights in the truth. Because there's no shortage of truths that exist that can be used to deceive one's own self, that can be used to deceive others. And the second line of verse 6 says, and you teach me wisdom in the secret heart. So heart, that is something that everybody sort of understands and intuits. The sense of feeling, emotion, that could be wound up in meaning and purpose as well. But the secret heart is the one that is not necessarily given to man. Well, given certainly, but not perceptible upon the sort of natural birth and natural upbringing without proper education. And it's through this enlightenment that the wisdom is seen within this secret heart, because it needs to be uncovered to be found. Otherwise it remains a secret. People are unaware of it. Only few know of it. Purge me with hyssop. I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but this is an herb that was grown in the Mediterranean. I believe it was used for religious purposes, for purification, certain ceremonies, and for healing. So purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, I shall be whiter than snow. So this is your traditional psalm, a bit of again, this sort of return back to being. It's not particularly elevated, it's not particularly low. It's just this process of recognition, understanding one's transgressions and gross immoral behavior, asking for forgiveness, asking for salvation, asking for, or stating that, once these transgressions have been recognized and have been purged from me, then it's the promise to lead others, to guide others in a righteous path. And of course, this is all wound up in the collective as well. There's talk of Zion, do good to Zion, in your good pleasure, build up the walls of Jerusalem, and you will delight in right sacrifices, in burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then bulls will be offered on your altar. And so it's It's almost a proper place, proper condition to offer these types of sacrifices. And so this is, again, it's a psalm of proper enlightenment, or a proper alignment. And this is often a pattern that I see in the Psalms. It's, you go through one or two Psalms that are very deep, and it takes a while to unpack them. And then you go through a Psalm like this, which is more, again, it returns to this being, this relationship to the objective, not necessarily the enlightenment of the relationship, but rather purely the relationship and the process of healing and uncovering, like I've said, the iniquities and transgressions. Now, exactly what they are unclear, but I think this is sort of the point. It's about the individual experience. It's about the individual process, the responsibility of the individual to find what that is and to reason through it. And by the process of reasoning through it, you come to a richer and broader understanding of where one should be in life, the sort of reflective nature. Psalm 52. The steadfast love of God endures. To the choir master, a maskil of David. When Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul, David has come to the house of Ahimelech. Why do you boast of evil, O mighty man? The steadfast love of God endures all the day. Your tongue plots destruction, like a sharp razor. You worker of deceit, you love evil more than good, and lying more than speaking what is right. You love all the words that devour, O deceitful tongue. But God will break you down forever. He will snatch and tear you from your tent. He will uproot you from the land of the living. The righteous shall see and fear, and shall laugh at him, saying, See the man who would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the abundance of his riches, and sought refuge in his own destruction. But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the steadfast love forever and ever. I will thank you forever, because you have done it. I will wait for your name, for it is good, in the presence of the godly. So, another straightforward psalm here. It's a sort of a recognition psalm, a delineation between the good and the bad. David is confronted by this person. He condemns him for his ways. He says in verse 6, the righteous shall see and fear, and shall laugh at him, saying, See the man who would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the abundance of his riches, and sought refuge in his own destruction. And the reason that they fear is because they know the consequences of this behavior. And so, by virtue of this, we understand, especially through Psalm 50, that we've talked about last time, that the way of being, this pursuit of the inferior good towards the riches and the abundances, if not placed in their proper context, will lead to the man going to Sheol, or this sort of void, and his soul, the immortality of the soul of man, doesn't survive. He hasn't left anything to the earth that is worthwhile. Even though his name may be on the land that he procures, it means nothing. And so the righteous would be fearful, because they want their lineage to persist. They want their conceptions, their ideas of love and the highest of the high, their moral pursuits, to be preserved in a solid tradition. And so to have somebody that does not pursue this, but rather like I said, goes after the inferior objects of our desire. They rob the future generations of this. They rob the people around them from this experience. And so they're afraid of it, because this is a lessening of the richness of life. It is the opposite of the enlightenment of the mind. It's a bit of a robbery. Psalm 53. There is none who does good. To the choir master according to Mahalath, a maskil of David. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, doing abominable iniquity. There is none who does good. God looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all fallen away. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. Of those who work evil, no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread, and do not call upon God. There they are, in great terror, where there is no terror. For God scatters the bones of him who encamps against you. You put them to shame, for God has rejected them. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion, when God restores the fortune of his people. Let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. So, an observation of the times, perhaps, that there are no good, righteous people on the earth. There are many that are corrupt, doing abominable iniquity. No one is doing good. This corruption that exists. Interesting, in verse 4. Have those who work evil no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread. And in verse 5, there they are, in great terror, where there is no terror. For God scatters the bones of him who encamps against you. You put them to shame, for God has rejected them. And so I think there is some wisdom here in the statement, there they are, in great terror, where there is no terror. Now what could that mean? And who are they? They, I believe, refers to the evil, the wicked people. And they are in great terror, where there is no terror. Now, this could mean that there is terror, that there is this sort of anxiety of the mind, this existential suffering of the individual, because they can't even recognize what plagues them. They can't recognize the divine spirit. And in this way, there they are, in great terror, where there is no terror. Nothing has happened to them. They just exist in this state of terror. For God scatters the bones of him who encamps against you. And so, the godless in this case, the evil, wicked, since they are without God, since they are without that firm rock to plant them, since they are uncertain of their existential suffering and what judges them, they feel this terror. And it ultimately leads to their destruction. Because it's weak. It has no foundation. Psalm 54. the Lord upholds my life. To the choir master with stringed instruments, a maskell of David. When the Ziphites went and told Saul, is not David hiding among us? O God, save me by your name, and vindicate me by your might. O God, hear my prayer. Give ear to the words of my mouth, for strangers have risen against me. Ruthless men seek my life. They do not set God before themselves. Behold, God is my helper. The Lord is the upholder of my life. He will return the evil to my enemies. In your faithfulness, put an end to them. With a free will offering, I will sacrifice to you. I will give thanks to your name, O Lord, for it is good. For he has delivered me from every trouble, and my eye has looked in triumph on my enemies. Another basic psalm here. This is reminiscent of the first book of the Psalms. You get a lot of this. David is suffering. In the Old Testament, we know his story. We know that his reign and his life were turbulent. There's a lot of internal dissension within Israel. A lot of people that wished to do him harm, that did not want him to rule over them. And I think through this suffering and this continued faith in the right direction is admirable. It's an interesting use of the space of the Psalms, I think. I can't quite say that's a negative thing. I think it is positive. Learning from such an experience is very useful. Because it's we can scarcely imagine the condition of a person, especially in the ancient world, who is just trying to survive, especially a person in a position of leadership, where the consequences of moving in the wrong direction can lead to death, whereas in the modern day we have many safety nets, let's say. We have many routes. We have a lot of cheap goods that can sustain us. But in those days, everything was a bit more elevated. Things were a bit more urgent, let's say. And so this type of testing, this testing of faith, is interesting to witness. I thought perhaps that is not one that is foreign to this podcast, but this idea of sacrifice. Upon reading the historical books of the Old Testament, there is this repeated sacrificing, different types of sacrifices, different ways to sacrifice, and it can be difficult, I think, in the modern context to appreciate what the purpose of these sacrifices were for. Now in Psalm 54, he says in verse 6, with the free will offering I will sacrifice to you. I will give thanks to your name, O Lord, for it is good. For he has delivered me from every trouble, and my eye has looked in triumph on my enemies. So I don't have too much to say here in terms of interpretation, but rather I would just like to reflect a bit on the offerings, in this particular case, the free will offering, but more so the sacrifice that comes from the offerings. Now, up the free will offering, I will say that if we're just going off the word, that it is sort of the free will of the individual that makes it a free will offering. That is to say, it is not a part of the covenant. It is not a law that they must do. It is something from the heart and from the soul. It is something that this individual wants to do. It is their free will to do so. And they are taking something of value to them and giving it up for a higher purpose. Now, often we see these sorts of things as, a sacrifice of an animal, the burning of something that could be used for some other purpose, meaningful purpose, mind you. It's not just some old book, dusty book in the closet, or some object that one might want to sell at a garage sale. This is a significant portion. Sacrificing an animal in the ancient world is sacrificing time. It's sacrificing future subsistence. Because within the sacrifice of something that is truly valuable, within the sacrifice of something that is required to sustain us, once we give it and no longer have it, we are left with the sort of, wanting would be the wrong word, but we are left with an appreciation. Now, of course, we can be robbed of something that is valuable to us, that sustains us, but robbery and offering, free will offering, and sacrifice are not the same thing. If it is truly from the heart, the true sacrifice will not immediately leave the person dejected and anxious because of the potential lowering of their material condition, but rather the freedom of sacrifice. And the sacrifice in this light, I think, has the opposite effect. It is the lifting. It is the lifting of and the accepting of the responsibility that is required to do more work, to sustain the self. But we do so that we can properly appreciate, we can further understand what it means to suffer in a certain sense, but also to learn to value things a bit differently, to re-evaluate our internal hierarchy, whether that be our ethical framework or the perception of our material belongings. And we do this to the highest possible being. We do this to what we call God. We do this to truth. We do this to intelligibility. We do this to the very thing, to our very existence. We say thank you. We say thank you that I'm able to be here and to experience it. I prefer this instead of nothingness. For in nothingness, I am nothing. Psalm 55. Cast your burdens on the Lord. To the choir master with stringed instruments, a maskil of David. Give ear to my prayer, O God, and hide not yourself from my plea for mercy. Attend to me and answer me. I am restless in my complaint, and I moan, because of the noise of my enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked. For they drop trouble upon me, and in anger they bear a grudge against me. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror overwhelms me. And I say, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Yes, I would wander away. I would lodge in the wilderness. I would hurry to find shelter from the raging wind and tempest. Destroy, O Lord, divide their tongues, for I see violence and strife in the city. Day and night they go around it, on its walls, and iniquity and trouble are within it. Ruin is in its midst. Oppression and fraud do not depart from its marketplace. For it is not an enemy who taunts me, then I could bear it. It is not an adversary who deals insolently with me, then I can hide from him. But it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together. Within God's house we walked in the throng. Let death steal over them. Let them go down to Sheol alive. For evil is in their dwelling place and in their heart. But I call to God, and the Lord will save me. Evening and morning and at noon I utter my complaint and moan, and he hears my voice. He redeems my soul in safety from the battle that I wage, for many are arrayed against me. God will give ear and humble them. He who is enthroned from of old, because they do not change and do not fear God. My companion stretched out his hand against his friends. He violated his covenant. His speech was smooth as butter. Yet war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. But you, O God, will cast them down into the pit of destruction. Men of blood and treachery shall not live out half their days, but I will trust in you. So quite a lengthy psalm compared to many, longer on average. And so what can we make of this psalm, of this song, perhaps? So we begin in the initial verses 1 through 3. Sort of a familiar plea to God. The sort of saying, listen to me now, because what afflicts me now, it burdens me so that it can threaten my very existence. He says, I am restless in my complaint, and I moan, because of the noise of my enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked. For they drop trouble upon me, and in anger they bear a grudge against me. And so this is classic David. This is, indeed, we could say everybody's out to get him, but it seems like everybody is out to get him. And for a righteous person, I think it's difficult to deal with the surrounding, what surrounds you, because the more righteous an individual, the more upright a person stands or walks, the more wicked everything around him is, or appears to be. Now there are two paths, I think, when one is confronted in this scenario, if they're lucky enough to find themselves learned enough, enlightened enough to be this type of upright, upstanding individual, both in depth of understanding our material reality in the scientific sense, but also the finer things that I've mentioned, like righteousness, justice, love. One path is the path of leadership, and that this burden is not allowed to infect the upright individual, so that they become in a condition similar to what we see here in verse 2. Attend to me and answer me. I am restless in my complaint, and I moan. Now certainly we are all subject, I think, to this state of being. But the path of the leader, even if they do have times of frailty, such as we experience here, will use this burden similar to, not dissimilar to, the rationale that we provided for the free will sacrifice. That is to say, the burden is taken willfully. It is accepted. The place of this upright individual is understood, given the multitude and the context of his surrounding environment. And he will take up positions of leadership, and he will lift up those around him. He will give light to those who cannot see. He will provide sharper detail to the perception of others. He will increase their ability to be with one another, increase another's understanding of harmony and of unity and of fulfillment. The other path, now I can't say that this is David's path, because I don't quite know, but what I can say is that the other path is the path of dejection. This, like we've said before in our previous example about the free will offering, that an offering and a robbery are not the same thing. A robbery, something is taken from you unwillfully, unexpectedly, without proper regard, proper orientation of the mind towards the good. But in the absence of any thought, of any sight. And in this way, the burden of the upright man, I think, can also afflict him. That it could be something that is wholly unrecognized. The individual denies the very perception of it. And I think this type of burden is the burden that is the denial of responsibility. It is the individualistic approach. That is to say, that even though this person may be upright, they choose a path of individualism, that they prefer to be alone, that they prefer to practice their virtue in silence and in peace, alone. And while it is not necessary that we need to abandon these if we are to choose to be just people or upright people, but there is an obligation that comes with enlightening the mind, of receiving those who are not of a similar condition. And so this second path, I think, this is the path that I thought of when I read these first 3 verses. Because I hear a man that has not quite accepted his responsibility and his leadership. However, there are many different situations, many contexts, and I can't say with a broad stroke such as that David is in the position of failing to accept his responsibility. But what I am saying is that it is possible that this is the condition of this man at this moment. And it's no wonder, when we think about our own lives and the things that we are confronted with, a relationship with a parent or a significant other, a coworker, And perhaps death too. In the modern day, perhaps not as frequently as in the olden days, but in verse 4 and verse 5 we see, "My heart is in anguish within me, the terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come over me, and the horror overwhelms me." We can certainly sympathize, I think, with David in this position, because death is a lofty thing. It's a lofty threat from one's enemies. And he goes by saying, "I wish I could escape this burden. I wish I didn't have to deal with it. I wish I was a dove so I could fly away. I wish I could just go and live in the wilderness. I would hurry and find a shelter away from the wind and the tempest, the storm." I think about this a lot in my own life. I think about moving away from the city, finding a nice rural location, just getting away, doing it myself, struggling with the burdens of my own life, trying to determine if the burdens are because of my own weakness or because of perhaps what David is struggling with here, with the wickedness of the world. Perhaps it's a bit of both. But again, what does it mean? What is the answer to this struggle? What does it mean if we are to run away? What if we are to grow wings like a dove and to flee? Have we done ourselves an injustice? Not to accept our burdens, not to face them head on? And what does it mean for us to face them head on? Does that mean we lean into them full-heartedly? Instead of moving away, growing wings, we make sure it's impossible for wings to ever grow, so that we can ever flee, and that we are always forced to face our reality. And perhaps that is right, even if one does prefer a life of solitude. Even the solitude have to confront their demons. "Destroy, O Lord, divide their tongues, for I see violence and strife in the city. Day and night they go around it, on its walls, and iniquity and trouble are within it. Ruin is in its midst, oppression and fraud do not depart from its marketplace." Just as it always has been, just as it is today. It's a terrible thing to struggle with. I know I struggle with it, especially if you want to commit yourself to doing the utmost, and you see the utter failure of the institutions, and to an extent the collective. And so he says, "Destroy, O Lord, and divide their tongues." Divide their tongues so they can't understand each other, so they can no longer do wicked deals, be corrupt, and be violent. Nothing is intelligible to them. They're sort of nothing more than slaves, obedient to animals. Or simply just disperse these people. For it is not an enemy who taunts me. Then I could bear it. It is not an adversary who deals insolently with me. Then I could hide from him. But it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together within God's house. We walked in the throng. This is a powerful statement, I think, a powerful reflection, because he's saying it's not just the wicked. I'm trying to do the best that I can here. I'm leading a life of righteousness. I'm walking the upright path. I recognize that there are those who do not choose to do similar. But it's not the person necessarily who wants to kill me. It's not the person that doesn't understand my ways that insults me. I could deal with these things. But it is you, which is a very personal way to begin that statement. I sort of felt it in my chest when I read that, as it was an accusation to me. Certainly, it could be an accusation to me. It makes me examine my own behavior, my own life. My equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together, and so forth and so on. I think this friend, this sweet friend and companion, could just as easily be one of the two parties that we often engage with in our own minds, this internal voice. Why do we have it if we're not having a conversation? The us that comprises the I. And so when we view it in this way, just as we can view it as a close personal friend external to us, the internal friend that's much closer, much more intimate, sharper detail, impossible to hide from, nearly impossible, because of course these days we have no shortage of drugs to dull the mind, not only to the internal suffering, but also to the divine judgment. We have dulled the mechanism by which we can perceive of it. He says, let death steal over them. Let them go down to Sheol alive. Let them go to this place of nothingness, this absolute lonesomeness, this place of lonesomeness. Let them go there alive. What a statement to make. How terrible it would be for an individual to find themselves in this life, in this existence, in a complete void, in a complete state of depression and anxiety, of being lost, with nothing to ground them. That's true terror. You know, I've seen individuals with advanced stage dementia, and I would have to imagine that it's something like this. The absolute fear, the dissolving of the self, the nothingness that surrounds them, the lack of intelligibility, not being able to remember a thing, nothing to support their feet, nothing to propel their steps. Terrible. Terrible thing it would be. For evil is their dwelling place and their heart. And so a strong punishment for a strong deception. But I call to God, and the Lord will save me. Evening and morning, and at noon, I utter my complaint and moan, and he hears my voice. He redeems my soul in safety from the battle that I wage. For many are arrayed against me. God will give ear and humble them. He who is enthroned from the old, because they do not change and do not fear. And what if I was to say that the psychopathologies of those of the ancient world were more fundamental? That is, in our day, we deal with depression, we deal with anxiety, we deal with attention deficit disorder. We deal with many different psychiatric conditions. But now imagine a society, of course in a loose sense, because even though we live in a post-enlightenment age, who is to say that any of us are truly enlightened? But there is a through line that we do live under a certain cultural inheritance and a certain way of thinking, a certain frame through which we view our reality and our world, and it's undeniably affected by the events of the Enlightenment, certainly by many events of history, biblical teachings, Greek philosophy. However, what if we were to rewind the clock, and our minds they did not have the benefit of a certain culture to allow them to see a certain way about their reality? Would it not be simple? More simple? This is not to say that these were inherently simple people. In many ways, they were solving the fundamentals that are necessary even for what we may consider to be a modern, enlightened person. If you forget the fundamentals, then what does it mean for the structure that you build upon it? Will it not just crumble and fall? And so what is this fundament? This mind that is emerging into something. The mind that humanity will always have. The mind that, as it has grown through the ages, it has represented a macrocosm that shrinks itself into a microcosm within the life of an individual, from infancy until old age. We are like the growth of the entirety of the human story. And without the thing to mature our minds, the fundament, again, what is there to build upon it? We have to start again with the fundament. And as we push it farther back, we remove it entirely. Only the lucky individuals will find it at some point in their life, much later than they should have. And so, when I think about these ancient people, I think about the degree to which they could suffer, about the true emptiness of thought and of being that they could have experienced. There were much less shiny objects for them to grab onto to satisfy them. They were forced to be as it was. No relief. They had to face their reality. And a tradition came along and it offered them light, a way of viewing and a way of seeing, a direction that they can move towards. They can walk up out of the darkness and into the light. I can imagine being an upright individual in a surrounding like this. Of course, we have a similar parallel in our own day, but different, no doubt. The ancient world had a unique set of responsibilities. And this must have been a fascinating thing to witness as a person in a position like David, to be a king of God's chosen people. And so I say again, but I call to God, and the Lord will save me. Evening and morning and noon, I utter my complaint and moan, and he hears my voice. He redeems my soul in safety from the battle that I wage. For many are arrayed against me. God will give ear and humble them. He who is enthroned from of old, and do not fear God. So I hope that puts into a bit of perspective. Because, our story is a story of, it's a lonely one. Although there are many of us, many of these thinking machines around. The other thinking machines around us have not matured with us, it would seem. And in that sense, we are lonely. Of course, we can invite them on as companions and save the ones that we choose. But still, we are lonely. We have one perspective. Of course, within our human perspective, there are many ways to be and many ways to approach life. But a fundamentally different creature would have a fundamentally different view of their reality, the way that they interact with it, the way that they process things, the way that they perceive. My companion stretched out his hand against his friend's. He violated his covenant. His speech was smooth as butter, yet war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. And so his companion is the wicked. And what if this companion, again, is within us? It is the fraction that makes up the whole, that is the deceiver. Whereas our good nature, our positive nature, the other part of that fraction of the whole, is drawn away from it. What kind of internal turmoil would that do? I think it would be terrible. In fact, I think there are many, perhaps myself, and anybody that may stumble across this in the future, may experience. And to you, I would say, it's okay. There's room for improvement. But you have to take my hand. You have to come with me. You can no longer be a burden to me. We must change together, for I am not whole without you. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. But you, O God, will cast them down into the pit of destruction. Men of blood and treachery shall not live out half their days, but I will trust in you. to the choirmaster, according to the dove on far-off terebinths, a victim of David when the Philistines seized him in Gath. Be gracious to me, O God, for man tramples on me. All day long an attacker oppresses me. My enemies trample on me all day long, for many attack me proudly. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you, in God, whose word I praise. In God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? All day long they injure my cause. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They stir up strife, they lurk, they watch my steps, as they have waited for my life. For their crime will they escape? In wrath cast down the peoples, O God. You have kept count of my tossings. Put my ear in your bottle. Are they not in your book? Then my enemies will turn back. In the day when I call, this I know, that God is for me. In God, whose word I praise. In the Lord, whose word I praise. In God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? I must perform my vows to you, O God. I will render thank offerings to you. For you have delivered my soul from death, yes, my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of life. So it is a few days later, and I am currently living in a new location for now. I'm currently living above a Mediterranean restaurant, which is kind of nice now that it is winter. I think that the heat of the kitchen is keeping my apartment warm. But one of the consequences of this recent move is that I have to be a little bit more quiet. So I'm not quite sure how much the neighbors can hear, and I don't wish to disturb them. So we are going to have to suffer through this proximity to the microphone. And so I'd like to say a thing or two before we get started, before we dissect Psalm 56. I have a tendency, and this tendency I wish to correct. But this tendency I have is for interpreting Scripture and failing to see its implications at many different levels. Many times I'll see its effects at the collective. Perhaps that's how my mind wishes to see things. I'll see things in terms of perhaps geopolitical condition. I'll also see it as the individual. There have been many times where I've referred to biblical teachings with reference to mind and consciousness. But I think if an interpretation fails and is unable to gain continuity between the different levels of reality, I think it's a bit lacking. It's as if one were pumping gas into their car, and the tube that carries the gas, the liquid gas, to the car had a break in the tubing or a block so that the flow could not reach the car to the gas tank. Of course, the implications of which would be that you would not be able to fill your tank, you would not be able to travel, you would not be able to utilize the tool or the instrument for your own purposes and apply it to your life, apply it to the things that you know. And so in this way, this sort of fractured sense of reality, I think, it's a part of a greater whole. And this greater whole, I think, needs to be continually recognized so that it doesn't remain atomistic. That at the very least we recognize that there are connections between the levels and that it scales. Just like a Russian doll, when it is all together, although there are many different pieces, as it moves smaller and smaller, these are different interpretations of reality from the macro to the micro scale. But they are all a part of this structure, this Russian doll structure. And if it was just the outer layer, I don't think we would consider it a Russian doll, because inherent to its function, to its purpose, to the meaning of the Russian doll, is that it has many smaller dolls within it. So what can we make of this first section here? It's comprised of 4 verses. Be gracious to me, O God, for man tramples on me. All day long an attacker oppresses me. My enemies trample on me all day long, for many attack me proudly. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you, in God whose word I praise. In God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? And so in some sense, again, we see something similar that we've seen in previous Psalms. This continual propositioning, perhaps, of God, or this appeal to God, this recognition of the human suffering, this differentiation between man and God, or man and the divine, and this sort of security that man gets in God, the sort of sense of satisfaction. Satisfaction is close, but that is not the correct word. It's more of a one-ment, a unity, a harmony, peace, inner peace. And of course, it's not just one way. It's not just internal to the subject. It flows through and back into man himself as he moves towards this celestial being. He interprets the celestial hierarchy, the ethical hierarchy, correctly. Being and thinking and participating, I think these all come together in harmony, and they are not separate things. Man feels completely engaged. And so, these types of appeals to God, to keep one safe from transgression or from others that choose to trample on them, in a sense, it's what can we make of it? Because we cannot place the highest value in terms of the dangers that come from the physical. Because in a sense, the physical is something that is finite. And humanity exists at multiple levels. It is not the individual experience that is most real. What is most real is the structure of reality itself. And so that is what we should strive towards. And so if reality of human experience, and so all of this is to say that humanity must be able to move through these levels independently. Humanity must be able to have the operating system that is able to see the multi-levels. Humanity must be able to sacrifice enough to return from the primacy of the individual back into the totalizing system of conscious minds and conscious thought, of the more definite forms of human progression that lies within things that are beyond the nature of man. These forces, although many of us wish to deny them or deny their existence until we've found evidence for such, it's not necessary to waste all that effort. For I think we understand almost intuitively that what we do in this life will impact life in the next. And so of this totalizing system, not just of the totalizing system of man, but also of the entire universe, everything within it collectively, I'm confident can say, in God, whose word I praise, in the Lord, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? And it's an interesting thing here to split this into man and God, man and divine. Because it's recognizing that there is a state of mind that has free will of its own, that can do it as it pleases. It's separate from the divine mind, in a sense. And so again, verse 11, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? It raises all sorts of questions as to what is the I, and what is that I's relationship to man? Is that I not the same as the man whom he wishes not to be afraid of if he entrusts in the Lord? And to that I would say no. Because although we are given free will, if we choose to deny what is right and what is true, or at least commit ourselves to it, because it is a process, no doubt, and will be wrong along the way, if we choose to deny it, then it's very likely that the flood will come. Society will fail. It will be forced into an unfortunate predicament of putting the forms of knowledge into the hands of very few. Though in those circumstances, I would imagine that those few who took it upon themselves to collect all that information would understand its importance, as Noah did, because he had faith. And so, of course, after making this recognition or this realization, David then goes on to say, I must perform my vows to you, O God. I will render thank offerings to you. For you have denied my soul from death, yes, my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of life. And so it makes perfect sense why these verses would come after the previous. And of course I say that because once we have undergone the epiphany of the potential destruction of the earth by unbridled behavior, by faith in inferior things, and this hierarchy, we can forfeit everything that is uniquely human. That is the human mind itself. And so, returning to vows, rendering thank offerings, is what one should do. It's just to be thankful for it, to commit yourself to it, and continue your life. Try your best to move into harmony with those around you. Move closer into harmony with the things that you do, whether that be your occupation or your hobbies. This is the way that one should be. Sometimes I wonder, especially these days, especially since the world is not quite the same, it always seems somewhat separate from whatever my nostalgic experience happens to be, my wishful experience. It's always this almost Matrix-like thing, the thing that's between two separate realities. Perhaps we can boil it down to the technological reality, and then the other of the sort of the old world, the here and now, the embodied sense, this presence. Whatever it might be, going through this process and experience, I think, makes me think about the ways that this could have happened in the past. Now, of course, I'm nowhere near as educated in history as I should be, but this pattern would be a lovely thing to find, a lovely thing to explore, because in their context, it had nothing to do with this seemingly alien force, this technology that's quickly becoming seemingly intelligent. And so these previous ages, when they went through these, it seems as though it was a more human experience. It wasn't augmented with machines and convenience, artificial ways of being, artificial intelligence, artificial scholarship, perhaps, artificial ways of seeing the world. And I always think about the French Revolution in this context. Sort of people wanting to have their independence, to be separate from the artificial, temporary authorities, the finite They felt that those who were in charge of the institutions were not worthy of being in that place. Of course, Americans felt that too. But that's a lot of responsibility to accept. If you deny the position of leadership and take on that responsibility yourself, if you're not ready for it, it'll crush you. I can't imagine taking a CEO position at a company. I know nothing about it. I can't imagine taking on that type of responsibility. And revolutions, I think, when you broaden them out a bit, it is this sort of mass collective taking of responsibility. Now, of course, they can go in all sorts of different directions. It just depends on the particular delusion that the mind is operating under, and in that age, and the next delusion that it takes itself to. Of course, that's a sort of a pessimistic way to view humanity. It certainly can be viewed as a staircase, humanity's staircase. After each new insight, each revolution of man, we find ourselves into a higher state of being, more in tune with our reality. And these major leaps, those that exist within the Christian evolution, perhaps the Greek, Roman philosophy, expansion, the collectivization of humanity going back even farther into farms, devising new technologies to speed our growth and to bring more and more people together. It's something that's going somewhere. And humanity is driving. And humanity needs a reason to do it. Of course, the reason doesn't mean we invent fanciful stories. The reason that we pursue, the reason that we do anything in life, is that we want to know what is certain, what is true, why we are here, and how we can improve in most cases. In the cases of the enlightened individual, they will want to improve their condition, whether it be material or otherwise. Psalm 57. Let your glory be over all the earth. To the choir master, according to Do Not Destroy, a Michtam of David, when he fled from Saul in the cave. Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for in you my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge, till the storms of destruction pass by. I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. He will send me from heaven and save me. He will put to shame him who tramples on me. God will send out his steadfast love and his faithfulness. My soul is in the midst of lions. I lie down amid fiery beasts. The children of man, whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. They set a net for my steps. My soul was bowed down. They dug a pit in my way, but they have fallen into it themselves. My heart is steadfast, O God. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and make melody. Awake, O my glory. Awake, O harp and lyre. I will awake the dawn. I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing praises to you among the nations, for your steadfast love is great to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. In this imagery, I imagine David to be sort of alone, perhaps a bit afraid, cold and hungry. He's in this cave, and he thinks to himself, if I'm truly going to be honest in this condition, if I'm truly going to make a plea to all that is good and all that is right, then I must ask of God mercy, because I bring to the table so many failures. That is the very case that he is in the cave in the first place. He was unable to maintain this order. He was unable to convince the mind of his enemies. He was just unable to live life as life should be lived. And so there are things at the personal level. When I say personal level, I mean of the type of experience that is almost one's direct experience with God. That personal level. Not seeing the world through the objective experience. Not seeing the world through the mobilization of the collective, but from and within the individual. For in you my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge. Till the storms of destruction pass by, I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. He will send from heaven and save me. He will put to shame him who tramples on me. God will send out his steadfast love and his faithfulness. That is quite the belief. It's quite the belief to have and to believe that something truly as awesome as absolute truth and beauty and love cares enough about you to save you. And that it is actually able to do it in a way that we recognize as saving. But what is this saving? What does it mean to be saved? Surely, in a sense, in the Christian context, it means to be forgiven, to not be burdened by the perennial burden of man, that he is a fallen creature, fallen of the divine, off of the divine. Well, I shouldn't put it that way. Created of the divine and left to its own devices. And I know many people who, if I said this to, they would think I'm crazy. They wouldn't understand what that means necessarily. But I think it infects everybody. We are drawn towards what feels good in a certain sense, although our feelings, we know, are not the best predictor of true reality. Because if we just purely followed our base desire, our feelings, we would truly be a animistic sort of society, perhaps pantheistic society, that everything is here and now, God is everywhere. But no, there are some who do still think this way, but it is our perspective that man has improved beyond this sort of way of understanding and of thinking. And now we are monotheistic, one God outside of our universe, creator and viewer of all things, whatever this might be. And in the future context, even the atheists have their God. They have their stories within the patterns of scientific reasoning, which are two true patterns, no doubt, but separated from their family, essentially. A child separated from his parents. It's doubtful that they will survive, but I shouldn't make the statement that the future is atheism, because we've always had atheism. It's just an absolute certainty and the uncertainty of things, or in the certainty that there is no certainty. A strange philosophy, don't you think? That there is nothing in this reality. What a strange detached mind that must be. What I should say is that the future, our future, will be made up of familiar castes, familiar and polytheistic patterns. Perhaps certain cults will emerge. I'm sure we already see them in our culture. The humanists may seek pantheism or be satisfied in their atheism, but eventually humanity will come full circle back to what is most true, whether that remains monotheism or if it's an updated software of a slightly different depiction of God, or a higher understanding, an understanding that we have yet to get to. Perhaps that is coming. Or perhaps we return to monotheism. We return to that framework. And that being all that we need to move forward and to continue. Certainly to have faith would be to have faith in the truth. And so we would have to make the distinction. Either the truth lies in monotheism, or there's something that we completely can't conceptualize at this moment. But even if it is that monotheism can morph into something different. That's not to say that we will not have carried anything with it, because it'll just be a higher level, a higher cap on the hierarchy that sits atop it. It's not as though monotheism destroyed polytheism. It united all the elements into one. Now, what can be more one than oneness, I'm not quite sure. Which makes me think that it probably is not much of a change if there's going to be one. We're likely to undergo a moderate patch to our software so that we can see beyond our purely materialistic, rationalistic reductionism. And hopefully artificial intelligence can assist us in that. My soul is in the midst of lions. I lie down amid fiery beasts. the children of man, whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. And so that's an interesting observation. The children of man, whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. Meaning this upcoming, perhaps I shouldn't even say that, it depends on the level, but it must be at that time, and also in past days, this child of man, as he continues to move himself out into the world, he finds power. And the teeth are spears, a sort of instrument that is used for consumption, for grinding, and for returning sustenance to our body. They're like spears and arrows. Now, instead of this sort of sustaining symbol, we have this tough, piercing symbol. Whose tongues are sharp as swords. A tongue, of course, can refer to speech. And so it's not just the case that their purpose does not fit the tools that they carry, but it is also the language that they use that does not fit reality. I think this is what he is saying here. They set a net for my steps. My soul was bowed down. They dug a pit in my way, but they have fallen into it themselves. My heart is steadfast. O God, my heart is steadfast. I will sing and make melody. Awake, my glory. Awake, O harp and lyre. I will awaken the dawn. I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing praises to you among the nations. And so he continues again to close out the psalm with the praising, the promise to praise. And so I will stop this episode here. And next time we will continue with God who judges the earth, which is Psalm 58.